So many people ask me that, it's really funny. No, I mean, I grew up in a small country town. I grew up in a family with a mother who had very severe mental illness, a lot of child abuse, a lot of family abuse, domestic violence. Can you tell us your title? Sure thing. I am the founding director of the Centre for Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne. That's my major role here in Australia, but I also have a second role, which is the president of the International Positive Psychology Association.
Oh my gosh, that is incredible. And you were a little girl from Lara in Victoria.
Correct, yeah.
Little country town.
I grew up in a really small country town. I think when I was growing up, Lara had maybe 8,000, no, it may be even less. It was a very small town. It's a little bit bigger now through urban spread, but very small, one traffic light, couple of primary schools, no secondary school.
Could you ever have dreamt that you'd be doing what you're doing today?
So many people ask me that, it's really funny. No, I mean, I grew up in a small country town. I grew up in a family with a mother who had very severe mental illness, a lot of child abuse, a lot of family abuse, domestic violence. I never imagined, that I'd even kind of rise above my childhood, let alone rise above in a way where I've been able to, I guess, make meaning of what happened to me, use my own sort of professional skills and network to prevent that from happening to other people, and help other people with their own mental health journey in an Australian context, let alone internationally. So no, I never imagined that I'd be where I am.
And so as a child, you're going through some pretty horrendous things. Was that the inspiration to think, I want to become a psychologist one day?
100%, yeah. I do. I remember being sort of in my mid-teen years, and Mum was struggling a lot at that time, so she spent time in and out of psychiatric institutions, multiple suicide attempts, and she was going through a period of where things were not very stable for her. And I really just remember saying, that's it, you know, I have to do something to help people who are going through this, and to help the children, help the families. I was really bad at maths at school, like terrible at maths, but I knew, all right, to be a psychologist, I have to actually do maths. So it was something that I endured, but from a really young age, I knew I needed to be part of the solution, having been a child who had come through suffering and the problem.
And so did you enjoy school as a youngster? Were you always academic?
Yeah. I did. School really suited me, and for a couple of reasons. One was, even aside from the academic, school for me was like my safe place. It was predictable. There were routines. I did well at school, so it was a part of my life where I felt good about myself and I got praised. I didn't want to leave school. I was really like, I don't want to leave school. I love this place. But I left school to go on to university, and you know, I was very committed to becoming a psychologist. So school for me was, I think it was, in psychology, we would say it was a buffering factor, it was a protective factor, because I felt safe and I did well. And one of my strengths is sort of, I love learning, I'm curious, I love doing research, I'm just academically oriented that way. So it was a part of my life where I could play to my strengths.
But even though you say it was a safe place for you, you had some serious bullying.
Yes, I did, unfortunately. So, I mean, when I look back on school, that my first response is always what I just said to you. It was a great part of my childhood. It was a protective factor. It was a buffering factor. I did have one patch where it was the opposite, and that was when I was 15, year 9. And you know, unfortunately, like all schools, there were bullies at the school. And then the difference these days, of course, is that we're talking about it. We've made it visible. We have programs in schools. We have government policy around it. Back in the 80s, so I'm talking early 80s, there was none of that. And so we had a group of girls who were bullies. And I mean, now I look back as an adult, especially as a qualified psychologist, and I feel a lot of compassion for those girls. I just think what was going on in their life, in their homes, that created them to act out in this way. But I mean, back then I didn't have any of that knowledge, and so what was my safe place became very, very unsafe. The trigger was because I stood up. They were bullying another girl, and I stood up for that girl, and I just had one of those moments. We were at the locker and they were picking on this girl, and I think I'd never been picked on, but I think I identified with the kids who were being picked on, because I knew what it was like to feel like I have this secret, my life is different to everyone else. And something inside of me just snapped, and I just thought, enough, this cannot go on. And so I stood between the girls and the girl they were bullying, and I just said, stop it, you have to stop this. And probably foolishly made the mistake of saying, why don't you pick on someone your own size? Which was like an invitation. Yeah. And so for 6 months, the 6 months, the final 6 months of my year 9, they took my advice, basically. And they decided to pick on someone their own size. And I think, again, I look back now, and what they were doing was they had kind of like a sprinkler effect. So there were a couple of girls who were the targets. And because I dared to stand up to them, they just decided, like, lock and load, let's just have one target. So it was very extreme. All the classic bullying, so social ostracisation, getting people not to talk to me, a lot of emotional stuff, rumours, like really vicious rumours around me having relationships with teachers and all that sort of stuff. And the final point, there was a lot of physical bullying, but the final point that made my parents realise, okay, this is not actually a safe place anymore, was some pretty extreme physical bullying. So pushing me to the ground, kicking me while I was down, trying to pull my earrings out, trying to burn my face with a cigarette, but it was very extreme. And that's the point in my life that actually triggered an eating disorder, because I had bullies at home and bullies at school. Like there was just so much violence, emotional violence, psychological violence, physical violence in my life. And I had also experienced sexual abuse at an earlier age, and it just got too much. And I just fell over the edge into darkness. Developed an eating disorder, and I had bulimia for 7 years, from the age of 15 to 22. My sister also had bulimia, my younger sister, and the interesting thing to me is that I functioned, and I did well at school, and I knew, because I had this really strong sense of purpose, I have to graduate, I have to go to university, I have to become a psychologist, and then I have to come back and help the kids like me. So I functioned well at school. I changed schools because of the bullying, and no one at either school knew what was happening at home. No one at either school knew that I was suffering an eating disorder, a lot of anxiety and depression.
So you'd learnt to put on a mask and everything?
I was very good at the mask. And I think partly because I was the oldest child in my family, so my role was to be very calm and to be very stable and to protect my younger brother and my sister and just keep everything calm. And so that, in psychology we would call that learned resourcefulness. It's a good quality in me that came out of difficult circumstances, but it can backfire in the sense that I was very calm and together, and at school no one would have known what was happening. And so I actually didn't reach out for help until I was halfway through my PhD in psychology. And I had I was doing neuroscience, and we had this particular lecture on a brain disorder. It's called Wernicke-Korsakoff disorder, and it's a degenerative brain disorder. And it occurs because of an inability to process vitamin B. So we were learning about this brain disorder, and the lecturer talked about how it's a very common brain disorder for long-term alcoholics, because one of the symptoms of long-term alcoholism is that you lose the ability to process vitamin B. And he was talking about that, and then almost as a throwaway line, honestly, I think it was just, you have these moments in your life that it's like, what if that didn't happen? So just as a throwaway line, we were discussing the brain, we were discussing this brain disorder. He was talking about how it's very common in alcoholics. And then he said, oh, and it can happen with people who have eating disorders. And that just hit me like, whoa. And I'm sitting in this PhD program. The only thing that I felt good about myself was my intellect. And I because of the eating disorder, because of my childhood, because of the messages that I'd been given, I had such bottomed out self-confidence. And that, the one thing that I knew that I had was I'm smart, and then I had this lecturer say, that's going to be taken away from you because you've had an eating disorder for the last 7 years. And so I was really just sitting there thinking, okay, what do I choose? You know, which one do I choose here? And because I had a lot of body image issues as well, it was basically like sitting there as a 22-year-old and going, do I be thin or do I be smart?
Did you speak up at that point, or was this all internal?
Completely internal. Again, because the long-term pattern was I'm very calm on the outside and no one would guess what was happening, and I'm studying a PhD at university, and but I did at that point said, okay, I need to get some help. And so I took myself off. I started working with a psychiatrist. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and worked with the psychiatrist around the eating disorder and just getting a much better understanding of my childhood. And the thing is that your biography shapes your biology, and people who haven't been through abuse, they think it's all in your head. They think that you're just being over emotional, and it's not. I mean, all of the neuroscience research now shows that growing up with adversity, and that can be abuse, it can be neglect, it can be poverty. Growing up with adversity, it gets into your cells, it shapes your biology, it redirects your nervous system, it shapes structures in your brains, it shapes your immune system. And the psychiatrist helped me to see that, okay, it's not about blame towards my parents, and it's really not, honestly. I tell my story now, I think in quite a neutral way. I have a lot of compassion for my parents. They went through their own suffering. I'm no longer in relationship with my parents. And that's an interesting thing, I think, as a society. Family abuse it's such a major social issue, and it's something that's just not talked about. And the latest statistics are showing us that every 13 minutes, a child in Australia is being abused.
That
every 13 minutes.
Is horrifying.
It's absolutely horrifying, and that's an underreport. We know that's an underreport. 1 in 4 girls at the moment experience sexual abuse, 1 in 7 boys. And that's just sexual abuse. Then you add domestic violence, physical abuse, emotional and psychological abuse. And again, there's no hierarchy to abuse. I don't want to say sexual abuse is worse than domestic abuse. Domestic abuse is worse than emotional abuse. It depends on the person. In my case, I had the trifecta. I had all 3. And that's often the case. You often find when you look at family structures that it's not just the physical violence or the psychological violence or the sexual abuse. They often co-occur, which is really sad. It's a major issue in our society. People aren't talking about it. Family estrangement. Since I've started to talk about the fact that I'm no longer in relationship with my parents, and again, I say that with compassion. They've had their own journey. People have this idea that forgiveness requires reconciliation. And what I've learned in my own journey is that forgiveness is about letting go of anger. It's about not living with darkness. It's about not living with bitterness. And it's as much for you as it is for the perpetrator.
And is it making sure that you're okay I can step away and not feel guilty for the rest of my life? It's finding the peace within that.
It's giving yourself permission to A, step away from a harmful relationship, and B, say, I deserve happiness, I'm worth happiness. And the biggest factor, there were 2 factors that helped me to make the decision to step away from my parents. To have forgiveness, but not have to reconcile, not have to re-enter a relationship that I know is an ongoing harmful relationship. One of those factors is a very positive factor, and that was becoming a parent.
I was just thinking, what a crazy life-changing experience that would have been for you personally, because there'd be so much attached to it.
Huge.
How did you approach it?
Do you know, I remember when I first went to see the psychiatrist when I was 22, maybe sort of like session 3, I started talking to him about, I want to be a mum one day and I want to do this differently. And I remember him chuckling because he was like, how old are you again? Like, I'm 22. It's like, when do you want to have kids? Oh, probably in my 30s. But I was so conscious and mindful of that. And I distinctly remember growing up and after various incidents of violence, soothing myself, like sitting in my room and crying and just saying, I will never do this to my children, I will never do this to my children, I will never do this to my children. So parenting was a massive factor in helping me to make the decision, because then you get that mother bear instinct and you're like, I'm not letting anyone, doesn't matter blood or anyone, no one is going to harm my children. So that was a very positive factor in helping to give me the permission. And look, it doesn't happen overnight. That didn't happen. The decision to fully step away, walk away from my parents, took about 15 years of slowly setting boundaries and reducing contact and, you know, kind of seeing them once or twice a year and not getting upset by some of the ongoing behaviour that was occurring. And the final push factor for me, which unfortunately wasn't the parenting was a positive factor in the decision. The final factor was losing my sister to suicide.
That is just heartbreaking. And you would have probably felt like a parent to your sister as well, did you?
I'm not going to pretend we had a perfect relationship, my sister and I, because when you grow up with abuse, and we were only 15 months apart in age, so I can't really remember my life without my sister. And we shared a bedroom. We shared the bus ride to school. We shared our clothes. She was younger, but she was more grown up than me. So she was always the one who like did my hair before I went to school. And this is the 80s, so we had the really big, those huge big fringes and the big hair. And she had a spiral perm. I've already got such thick hair. It would have gone afro on me, but we shared so much. And unfortunately for us, we shared abuse. We were both raped by the same man. We shared the same parenting. We shared the same psychological, domestic violence, emotional abuse. So that bonds you in a really, really distinct way, but it also makes things quite complicated. So I don't want to pretend we had a perfect relationship, but we really knew each other and we loved each other.
Had each other's back.
We really did. And because I was the oldest, I did step into that role of like the protector, and she struggled more in her adult life than I did, and so I kind of stayed in. And I'm also a qualified psychologist. She was a qualified social worker, and I just find that really interesting that we both, that was the way that we made meaning of our childhood, was to grow up and get qualified and go and help other people. And she was just a really beautiful person, very caring and kind, do anything for anyone, and probably didn't learn the technique of self-kindness and self-protection. And so losing her, I think it was just a moment of clarity for me where I'm like, I cannot be in relationship with these people anymore, and I need to step away in order to protect myself. And a huge moment for me in terms of adding to my own healing journey. So I mean, I pretty much have been in therapy since I was 22 and I'm 47. It's like a quarter of a century of on and off therapy. And I've tried everything. You know, I've done traditional therapy and I've done psychiatry and I've done all sorts of modalities, you name it, mindfulness, kinesiology, yoga. I changed my diet, everything.
Did you see it coming at all, or?
Yeah. She was struggling. And
obviously there for her, but you just don't know, do you?
No. It was not her first attempt. And I had got her in to see a psychologist after her first attempt, and she was doing pretty well. And then she started to struggle again, but she reached a point where she didn't want to be helped. And actually, truthfully, in those final few months, she cut me off. And she cut off a couple of her friends and some other people who were close to her. And now I understand retrospectively. I understand as a sister who lived the same journey as her. I understand as a qualified psychologist that she had probably had made the decision, and she had cut off the people who she knew would help her to change her mind. But I didn't know that at the time, so I just figured, okay, I have to be careful how I tread with this. I'll wait until she makes contact. And which she did. I mean, that was invariably, that was part of our pattern. We both had attachment disorders. So part of her pattern was to sort of like, I can't handle this, you're just out. And then a couple of weeks later, you get some random text about an 80s song. And then you'd know, okay, I'm back in. And I was waiting for that text, and I didn't get it. But I just thought, I don't want to I don't want to die with that level of pain inside of me that she had, and I need to start showing some self-kindness. And so that's the journey I'm on right now, and it's bloody hard.
Is it a constant reminder to yourself?
I've done a lot of mindfulness over the years, and I think that that helps, because what it's doing is I tune into what's happening and I listen to the just really destructive, awful, tearing thoughts that I would never say or think to anyone else.
It is really not until you stop and hear what you're saying to yourself that I was exactly the same. I was my own worst enemy.
Oh, it's really, really awful.
Did anyone else
No, it's so toxic. The things that I say to myself are just so dark and so toxic and so punishing, cold and cruel and rejective. And I understand, like, I internalise a certain voice, but I can change that. You can't change your past, but you can create multiple futures. And self-kindness now is a really big piece of that. So yeah, it's about tuning in. A big piece for me around the self-kindness and the self-compassion is my energy levels. So it's not just the thought processes of, I tell myself really, really awful things. And I've learned through cognitive behavioural therapy and through my own kind of training as a psychologist to counteract that. That's very intellectual. It's actually just listening to my energy levels. And people, it's a good and a bad thing. People say to me, how have you achieved what you've achieved? By this age, 47, professor at top university, president of International Positive Psychology Association, author of a book, 100 psychology journal articles. And I kind of laugh and have to say it's because I have ignored my body, basically. I push myself way too hard. I don't sleep enough. I got my validation through achievement rather than sort of core bedrock love. And I understand that now. So I'm kind of at one level taking my foot off the accelerator a little bit. And in those moments where I'm tired now, that's where the kindness comes in. It's such a funny thing to be kind to yourself about. It seems like so simple.
So letting yourself have a rest.
Yeah. You know what? You're tired, just
sit down, watch some rubbish TV.
Have a nana nap, go to bed early. So they just seem like such common sense things. And I feel like even when I'm saying that to you, it's a bit embarrassing to admit that I wasn't doing that stuff. I'm a qualified psychologist, but I wasn't. Every time I got tired, there was just this, no, you must push forward, you must push forward, you must push forward. And that's not kindness. Yeah.
But the underlying it, you're on a mission to save as many people as you can underneath it. Would you say that?
100%. I think the reason I'm here, not just here, like not just here at the University of Melbourne, like here as a soul, is absolutely to do everything I can to protect and support and build the mental health of as many young people in Australia as I can.
If you enjoyed that video, don't forget to like and subscribe so that we can keep you up to date with all our latest content.